Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of a teaching series we're calling The Good Life. We're all chasing life, right? Whatever we perceive to be or we're taught to think is the good life. We chose to film this teaching series in this gorgeous model home, largely because homes like this are symbolic for many of us who live in our kind of Western contemporary American culture, right? For us, the good life, whatever our image is of the good life, usually involves living in a place like this. And it's not that wanting a nice home is in any way wrong or sinful or something like that. We sort of chose to film here just to draw the contrast to say, you can have a beautiful home like this and all of the other wonderful, nice things that many of us have, and still feel like you're not really living, still feel like something's missing. And I think, sadly, that's the commentary of a lot of people who live in our culture. We have a lot of nice stuff, but we sense that there's something missing. And because we know, intuitively we know that whatever the good life is, it's obviously more than just what we own, what we have. It's a feeling, it's a sense, right? Life, full life, abundant life is this being connected, feeling alive, awake, like your life has meaning and purpose. And you can have a lot of nice stuff and not feel that way. So that's what we're talking about in this series. I've heard it said, and you've probably heard it said, that if you want something, you go to somebody who's got it, you ask them how they got it, and you do whatever they do or whatever they tell you to do. And I'm sort of starting the premise of this whole series is I think Jesus of Nazareth was the most connected, awake, alive, had the most meaning-filled, purpose-filled life of any person who's ever lived. And by contrast, he didn't have half of what most of us have, right? But he was alive. And so what we're doing in this series is we're coming to Jesus, and we're saying, okay, Jesus, why don't you teach us what the good life is all about? What's your version of the good life, and how do you live in it? Right? And the way that we're doing that is we're looking at short stories that Jesus told when he was alive to people to try to describe this. His version of the good life is what he called the kingdom of God. And to try to get people to understand what it was and how to live in it, he told these simple short stories. And so every week in this series, we're looking at one of those, and then we're talking a little bit about what's Jesus' version of the good life and how would we live in it. So the story we're going to look at today comes from the rendition of Jesus' life as described by a guy named Matthew, who, before he started following Jesus, was a tax collector who spent his entire career ripping people off so that he could live high on the hog, which I think is an important backdrop for the story that you're about to hear. So this is what the story says. This is in Matthew chapter 20. It goes like this. For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. At noon and again at 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, he was in town again and saw some people standing around. He asked them, "Why haven't you been working today?" They replied, "Because no one hired us." The landowner told them, "Then go out and join the others in my vineyard." That evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a full day's wage. When those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more, but they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner. "Those people worked only 1 hour, and yet you've paid them just as much as you paid us, who worked all day in the scorching heat." He answered one of them, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as I paid you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others? So those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last." So there's a guy who owns a vineyard. He needs workers. It's harvest time. He needs people to come and work his vineyard, harvest his crops. So he goes into town and he hires a bunch of day laborers early in the morning, at the beginning of the day. He agrees to pay them the normal day's wage. They agree, and they go off and they start working. He comes back to the vineyard 4 more times that day, again at 9, noon, 3, and 5, and he hires more people every time he goes there, and it's the same sort of arrangement. He offers to pay them what's right, they agree to that, and then they go work. When the day's over, he has his foreman round up all the workers and pays them, starting with the people who were hired last. Much to their surprise, I imagine, they get paid, instead of for just an hour, they get paid a full day's wage. And the foreman continues to pay everyone a full day's wage all the way down, including the people who actually worked all day. Of course, the people who worked all day, when they receive only a day's wage, knowing what everybody else got, they get angry. They protest against the owner. Wait a minute. We actually worked all day. They worked for an hour and got a full day's wage. Shouldn't we get more then? But it's the vineyard owner who has the final word in the story. He says to the workers hired first, "You haven't been treated unfairly. You didn't get less than what you were promised." Right? The fact that I chose to pay everyone, including people who only worked an hour, a full day's wage is none of your concern. Or is it? Jesus' world, the economic world, was pretty stratified. And that is to say there were 2 basic categories. You had rich people and you had poor people. So you had people like the vineyard owner who owned land, and then you had poor day laborers. Now, there was a little stratification among the poor. So people like Jesus and some of his students, like Peter and John, who were fishermen, they were skilled tradesmen. They were probably a little better off than other people who would have been in that poor class. But largely because of the super oppressive tax system that everybody lived under, anybody kind of in Jesus's class would have basically lived hand to mouth. All that to say, there was no middle class. People didn't have the ability to accrue personal wealth. They didn't have rainy day funds. And in addition, there was no, large kind of federal welfare system. So basically, if you didn't work, you didn't eat. People needed to work as a way of life. And like any economy, there were rules in Jesus' day that governed the relationship between employers and employees. So today we have a kind of large federal legal apparatus that does that. But in Jesus' culture, it was based on local custom. So every town or every small region would decide locally what a fair wage was for a day's work. And because theirs was an honor-shame culture, if you did not abide by the custom, that would not go well for you. So if you were an employee, if you were one of these day laborers and you got hired on to work at a vineyard and you showed up and you kind of goofed off and didn't do your job and that sort of thing, word would get around and you probably wouldn't get hired the next time you were standing looking for work. The flip side was also true. If you were a vineyard owner and you showed up and you hired people and you agreed to pay them all day and they came and worked all day and then you paid them half a day's wage or something like that, word would get around. And the next time you came to town looking for workers, there wouldn't be anybody there wanting to work for you because nobody wants to get taken advantage of, right? In Jesus' world, economically, people lived in these kind of thick, interdependent relationships, right? Workers needed land to work, so they needed landowners, but they needed landowners to be fair and honest. They needed landowners who appreciated them coming to work and paid them fairly. The flip side was also true. Landowners obviously needed workers to come and harvest their crop, but they needed workers who were honest and good, who valued working and saw it as a gift, right? Every indication in this parable is that that's the reality you have here, right? The vineyard owner comes to the marketplace, he hires people, he agrees to pay them the normal day's wage, so that would have been what everyone understood as the customary amount or whatever that town or region had established as this is what's an appropriate day's wage for a day laborer, and they agree to work for that. And when he comes back at 9, noon, 3, and 5, and he tells the other workers, I'll pay you whatever's right, they agree to come work for whatever that is, and they would have understood what that meant. So there's no sense in the parable where anybody's being taken advantage of. Everybody has agreed to the arrangement. Everybody's going to be treated fairly. Nobody is going to get less than what they've agreed to work for or what's less than what's right. That's the situation that you have here. But like all of Jesus's parables, there's usually a twist. There's usually this element that just does not make conventional sense where what Jesus is really trying to say, where you're going to find it. And in this case, of course, it's what the vineyard owner does. going back to the marketplace 4 more times during the day at 9, 12, 3, and then again at 5 with only 1 hour left in the day. And he actually hires people each time he goes back. Now, there's a couple of explanations for why you would do something like that. The first is he didn't know how much labor he needed, right? He just misjudged how many workers he needed, and so he had to go back and he had to get more. And that's possible, although it's not probable. It's not likely. Most people know their industry well enough to know how much labor they need for a particular job. So in a former life, I used to take high school kids to this cookie packing factory to raise money for summer camp trips. The foreman at the factory knew exactly how many people I needed to bring so that we could get the job done and maximize profits. So if we brought too few people, we probably wouldn't hit our quota and the kids would make less money per head. If we brought too many people, we'd hit our quota, but you'd have to divide the proceeds amongst more people and everybody would make less per head. There was a very specific number that foreman knew. If to get the job done and for you to maximize profits, this is the number of people that you need to bring. And that's true of most people. I doubt this vineyard owner didn't know how many laborers he needed. It wasn't his first rodeo. So it probably wasn't that. The second explanation is that maybe there just weren't enough workers there early in the morning. I mean, we're not all morning people, right? Life was hard in Jesus' culture. It's possible that lots of people who intended to work that day got up, they had to deal with stuff, and it just took them a little longer to get to the market, and so they missed that kind of first wave, and the vineyard owner had to come back a few times to get more people. And again, that's possible, but it's not likely. I mean, I would understand that as an explanation if he went back once, maybe 2 more times, but he goes back 4 more times, including with only 1 hour left in the day. I mean, am I to assume that he was so hard up for workers that he went back with only 1 hour left in the shift as if like, oh my gosh, if I don't get 3 more workers and get them back to my vineyard, we're not going to make the quota for the day? Probably not. It probably wasn't that, he didn't hire enough to begin with, which leaves us with the only explanation that makes any sense to me. And I think it's the one that Jesus is trying to get at. And that's that this vineyard owner going back 4 more times and hiring people every time had nothing to do with needing more labor. He didn't need extra workers. This had everything to do with providing for people. The reason that the vineyard owner goes back to the marketplace 4 times and hires people every single time he goes and then ends up paying everyone a full day's wage is for 2 simple reasons, I think. Because they needed it and because he could. Because they needed it and because he could. Right? I mean, I already told you that these people lived in these thick, interdependent web of relationships. They relied on each other, right? For day laborers, like the people in our story, work was a necessity. Everything in the story would suggest to you that they wanted to work, that they were able to work. There's nothing in the story that would suggest that somehow they were defective workers or anything like that. They wanted to work, they were able to work, and culturally speaking, they needed to work. Work was a necessity. They didn't have rainy day funds and all kinds of things that they could just rely on. If they didn't work, they didn't eat. And the vineyard owner knew that. The vineyard owner knew these are people, if they don't work, they don't get paid. If they don't get paid, they can't feed their kids. But more than that, he knew that he could do something about it. Right? He saw it as his moral obligation to take care of people. That for him, it wasn't about needing more workers. It was about using what he had to provide for people. I think that's why he pays them all a day's wage, because that's what they all needed. I mean, he could have, every time he hired a new group and he offered to pay them what was right, he could have paid them a prorated amount. That would have been entirely fair, totally fair. In fact, that's what they expected, I'm sure, when they hired on. But it wouldn't have been enough. A prorated amount wouldn't have been enough to feed a family of 3 or 4. They needed a full day's wage in order to be able to take care of the people they love, and this vineyard owner knew that, right? In our world, we tend to say that, things like, this is business, it's not a charity. In Jesus' vision of the good life, I think business is charity. business is charity. Jesus isn't a socialist, right? The idea is not that everybody would own the same amount. I mean, in the story, you still have a wealthy landowner and you still have day laborers. And when the story's over, even though the day laborers got paid a day's wage, I'm pretty sure the landowner is still the landowner and they're still day laborers. And I'm sure the landowner still has more money in his bank account than they have in theirs. Jesus isn't a socialist. The vision's not socialism. But it's also not capitalism, at least not in the way that we typically operate or pursue it in our culture, right? For us, business is about maximizing shareholder value. It's about maximizing personal profit. I mean, business people are like the foreman at the factory that I went to are typically very shrewd about expenses, right? You don't spend money you don't have to spend. You don't hire people if you don't need them. Because to pay people you don't need will just cut into your profit margin. That's typically how business operates. That's not how this story operates, right? In Jesus' idea of the good life, you have workers and you have employers who depend on each other. And instead of the primary purpose being maximizing shareholder value or maximizing personal profit, it's caring for one another. That the purpose of business isn't to make money, it's to employ people. It's to create jobs so that people can work and they can make a living wage so that they can take care of their loved ones. Right? Far from it's business, it's not charity. I think in Jesus' idea of the good life, business would be charity. That people would work in a certain way and employers would employ in a certain way. That the primary idea would be that everybody's cared for. That nobody gets less than what they're promised. Nobody gets less than what is right. And the fact that everyone is cared for and everyone gets what they need is everybody's primary concern. That's the most important thing to everyone involved, whether they're the worker or the vineyard owner. And I think that's why the vineyard owner has such a problem with the response of the workers who were hired first. I mean, not only does it betray a kind of entitlement and not a gratitude, which is an important thing. I mean, we all understand that this guy hiring workers with 1 hour left in the day, that's a gift. He doesn't have to do that, but he knows they need it. That's a gift, and we can all see that. But to see that as a gift could kind of obscure or sort of overshadow the fact that hiring people early in the morning is equally a gift. Yeah, they had to endure the heat of the sun all day long, but I want you to think psychologically about the difference, right? First thing in the morning, they get hired. From that moment, all day long, they have the gift, the peace of mind of knowing that today, at least today, I'm going to work, I'm going to get paid, and I'm going to be able to go home, and I'm going to be able to look my spouse in the eye, and I'm going to be able to take care of my family. At least today or tomorrow for a couple of days, we're going to be okay. And you get to live all day today with that peace of mind. The workers hired last didn't have that peace of mind. They stood around in the marketplace all day, not because they didn't want to work, not because they couldn't work, not because somehow they were effective, but the story says they just didn't get hired. See, maybe all of the other vineyard owners weren't primarily concerned about taking care of people. Maybe all the other vineyard owners, like lots of business people, were primarily concerned with maximizing shareholder value or increasing their own personal profit. And if that's your primary goal, if that's your primary value, well, then of course you're not going to hire workers you don't need, right? So they didn't get hired on. So all day long, they stood in that marketplace, not goofing off, not gaming the system. They want to work, but no one hires them. And all day long, they have to worry. All day long, they have to think about that dreaded moment where they're going to have to go home and they're going to have to look at their spouse and they're going to have to look at their kids and they're going to have to say, sorry, guys, it's going to be another day or two before we can eat. If they could have traded places with the workers who got hired first, they would have done it in a heartbeat. So one of the problems with the workers who hired on first with their response is it just lacks gratitude. Man, work is a gift. The fact that we get to work and we get to apply our energy and time and talent to things that matter and we get to apply, that's a gift, right? But their response is problematic on a much deeper level, not just because they're not grateful for being able to work, right? It's because it betrays the spirit of this good life that Jesus is trying to describe and talk about. right? The reason the vineyard owner hires these workers last and pays them a full day's wage is because they need it. That's what they need. The workers who hired first, their response reveals that they care less about what another person needs, and they care more about how much is going into their personal pocket. That's the problem. The problem is that they don't see their fellow worker the way that the vineyard owner does. The vineyard owner sees these workers and thinks, these people need a full day's wage. I can provide a full day's wage. I'm going to provide a full day's wage. The workers who hired first, they care more about their own personal financial security, how much money's in their pocket. I think what the vineyard owner and ultimately Jesus is trying to communicate is you should be somebody who, when somebody else gets what they need, you should be thrilled about that. Because you're getting what you need. You're not getting any less than what was promised. You're not getting any less than what you agreed to. You're not getting any less than what is right. It's just that they're getting what they need too. And that should be your primary concern. The fact that it's not their primary concern is the problem. In Jesus' version of the good life, that's how it works. You've got people whose primary concern is that everybody has what they need. Not everybody's going to have the same, but that everybody has what they need. Nobody gets less than what they've been promised or less than what's right. Some people might get more than they've technically earned because it isn't about that. It's about what they need and what others can provide. And we all look at each other and we go, as long as you have what you need, that's important, right? Regardless of what I have, right? It's not about me having more. It's about making sure everybody's got what they need. Right? The parable isn't, the parable's titled The Workers in the Vineyard or The Laborers in the Vineyard. Sometimes titles can be deceiving. That title might lead you to believe that the most important action in the parable is what the laborers are doing or what's happening in the vineyard. The way that Jesus tells the story, clearly the spotlight isn't on the workers, it's on the vineyard owner. It's what the owner of the vineyard does. The owner of the vineyard is a model for how we're supposed to live in this world. That concern for our neighbor is supposed to be our primary value, not how much money is going into our pocket, but making sure that everybody around us has what they need. And if we happen to be in a position where we can do something about it, we do something about it, even if it means we have a little less for ourselves. That's how we're supposed to live. I want you to imagine, right? I want you to think about life. Tell me that's not a good life. Tell me that's not a better life than the world that we've carved out for ourselves, right? It is true that people globally are getting wealthier, but we still have today the largest wealth disparity probably in the history of humankind. And most people around the world are still living on $2 or less a day. Now that's a huge problem. I have no idea how to fix it as it stands right now. But if people from the very beginning operated toward one another the way that Jesus describes in this parable, we probably wouldn't live in a reality like that. It's a better way to live. Can you imagine if you just got up every day and you knew you were going to get to apply yourself to a job, you were going to be able to have some dignity and do something with your life, and you knew you were going to get paid what you needed to take care of your loved ones? Imagine how good it would feel if, as a business owner, you were less concerned about growing the bottom line and getting rich and putting money in your pocket, and you were more concerned about helping as many people as you could, even if it meant hiring people you didn't technically need. Wouldn't that be a better life? And the vineyard owner is a model, I think, for the way that we're supposed to live in Jesus' version of the good life. But of course, it's a model for how we're supposed to live because it's also a model for who God is. Where God is like the vineyard owner. God's the vineyard owner who looks at us and says, this isn't about what you earn. You don't have to earn it with me. This is about what you need and what I can provide. So we are people who need grace. We need mercy. We need forgiveness. We need meaning and we need purpose. And God is someone like the vineyard owner who comes back to the marketplace, at 9 and 12 and 3 and 5, and finds us standing around because nobody else will put us to work. and invites us to come be a part of something, and then pays us far more than we deserve, gives us himself, gives us grace and mercy and forgiveness and meaning and purpose. You don't earn it with God, right? It's not about, what you can do or what you can't do. It's all a gift. God is a God of love who looks at us and says, okay, what do you need and what can I provide? And effectively everything you need, I can provide. And so I will. And that's simply how it works. Or at least it's how it's supposed to work. That's the reality that Jesus imagines us living in. A world where I get up every day and the things that I need most, happiness, joy, resources to provide for my needs, peace of mind, healthy relationships, meaning, purpose, a sense that I'm all right, that life's all right, that things are going to be okay. All of those things that I need most, God knows that I need them and is like a vineyard owner who can provide it. And so whether you hire on early in the morning or middle of the day or with 1 hour left in the shift, you get paid what you need because God will never give you less than what you need. That's the promise. See, in Jesus' version of the good life, business is charity because God's business is charity. I truly believe that Jesus' vision of life, of the good life, it's better. It's better than what we carve out for ourselves without him. That life isn't supposed to be a scurrying rat race where we're just preoccupied with ourselves and what we have. It's a life where we're meant to be able to rest in the light and easy reality of a God who loves us, who knows what we need, and who promises to make sure that we'll have it, so that we can then turn out into the world and be people who provide for one another. That we can live in these thick webs of interdependent relationships where we rely on each other and we love and we care for one another, right? Where business is charity, where all of us, our primary concern is making sure that everybody else is okay. Because that's God's primary concern, is making sure that we're okay. And God went all the way to the cross to make sure that we would be. I hope that's a vision of life that you want to start living in more deeply. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for who you are, for how good you are to us. We are grateful for the life that you have created for us to live in. We confess that we don't live in it every day. We confess that sometimes the vision of it is very challenging to us. It's hard to get our minds around. It challenges some of the things that we want. I pray that we would hear the things that you say, that we would wrestle with them, and that ultimately we would find ourselves trusting you, listening to you, and beginning to reshape our lives around how you tell us to live. And that the result would be we would start to really experience deep, full, abiding life. So grateful that you love us so much to give us that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.